In this video, we're going to go from Beethoven to Bebop and what classical players need to know in order to master this art form we know as jazz. Hey, it's Paul Tobey from Jazzmentl.com. Thanks for joining me for another one of my tutorials. It's a common question in various Facebook groups or that I get on the Jazzmentl channel. How do I, as a classical musician who's been playing the piano or any instrument for many years, how do I go from that to being able to improvise? And how do I make nice chords? I think a lot of classical players believe that because they have certain skills at the piano that will make it easier for them to become improvisers. But that's not necessarily the case, and there are no shortcuts. So let's dive in and get started with the things that you absolutely need to know. The first element of being a jazz player is probably the most overlooked one, and that is what we call listening skills. Now, when you're listening to classical music, you're basically listening to musicians who are performing notes that were written by other great artists. In jazz, everything or most things that you're listening to are improvised. And so how do you actually listen to that? What are you listening to? And how can this help you become a jazz player yourself? Let's take a look at some specific listening skills that you need to develop. We're going to listen to a quartet that I know. In fact, I've played with all of these players except for the piano player, which is Mark Eisenman. But essentially what I want you to listen for is a few things. One, we're going to play the head. So listen to the saxophone play the melody. Listen to the piano player comping and improvising chords behind the saxophone. Listen to the bass player walking. He's playing basically a note for every beat of the bar. And then, of course, listen to the drummer, keep time, and make fills. What you're listening to is a very fast-paced tune called Just One of Those Things. It's a jazz standard that most musicians or jazz musicians are expected to know. Listen to the drummer playing with sticks. He's basically hitting the ride cymbal in swing time. And of course, the piano player is making tons of fills. He's playing lines and comping behind the saxophone. Listen for these things. I'm going to fast forward to the piano solo. And what you're listening to now is the piano player using the bebop language to solo over the changes of the tune. Let's listen to a little bit of that. So clearly you can hear that he's improvising. He's basically using the changes of the tune and the language to make up some kind of interesting solo. Let's fast forward to the saxophone solo. Now, this is my good friend Mike Murley. I've actually recorded a couple of albums with him. If you were listening, you could clearly hear where the piano player left off and the saxophone takes over. That would happen at the end of the tune. One player would finish his solo and another player would pick up at that point. The saxophone and the piano are different in basically one regard. The saxophone player plays one note at a time, where the piano player can play lines with the right hand and comp with the left hand. And this is essentially the way you listen to jazz. I would recommend that you listen to more than one band. You want to listen to the greats like Miles Davis and Bill Evans, but you also want to go out and listen to local musicians play at gigs such as this one. And what's happening is over time, as you continue to listen and work on your listening skills, You're learning to discern between the different instruments, the different types of soloing that they play, the language that they're using, and the conversation between the musicians. The next skill you'll need is to develop what we call swing feel. Now, in classical music, everything is pretty much straight eighths. It means that the notes are even. If you've got 10 eighth notes in a row, every single one of those notes is even. In jazz, when you see eighth notes, those are played very differently. Let's talk specifically about what that sounds like and what you should be looking for. When you're comparing classical music to jazz, the biggest difference is going to be feel. The jazz musician is making eighth notes swing. They're playing the first eighth note a little bit longer than the second one, and they're putting an accent on the second eighth note. For example, a scale in classical music, an A minor scale, would be this. A jazz musician would play that swing eighths like this. So you can clearly hear the difference. So let's now apply that to a tune like You'd Be So Nice to Come Home To, which is on the screen right now. It's a jazz standard. So a classical musician would play this straight like this. And that's pretty much what we call straight eighth feel. The accents are on 1 and 3 of the beat, and then the eighth notes are played straight, evenly. In jazz, you want to swing it, which means the accents are now moved to the second beat and the fourth beat of the bar. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Those are where the accents are. And the eighth notes are now swung, and the accent is on the second eighth note. Let's play a little bit of this tune with a jazz swing style. So you can hear the difference between those two. That's what classical players need to learn first. I think it's that swing feel that a lot of classical players tend to underestimate in terms of what you need to learn when you first start playing jazz. Okay, the next thing is sheet music versus lead sheets. In classical music, you're performing an entire piece that was written and arranged by someone else. All of the notes are there. All the accidentals are there, the dynamics, and everything is written down for you. You don't have to improvise anything. But in jazz, it's very different. We work from what is called lead sheets. Let's talk specifically about what a lead sheet is by taking a look at one right now. Lead sheets are definitely the lifeblood of the jazz industry. Musicians rely on them to get through gigs based on the fact that they can't possibly know every song available. And so if someone calls a tune that you don't know, you would basically turn to the lead sheet to improvise along with the rest of the band. An example of a lead sheet is on your screen. It basically provides a guide on how to improvise over the tune. So it includes the melody line, which you can clearly see running throughout the treble clef. And in addition to that, the chord symbols. So the chord symbols are basically the harmony that you would use to improvise on the tune along with the melody. Now, if you're a piano player and the saxophone player, such as in the example we listened to, is playing the melody, then your job is to comp along with that using those chord symbols. So from A minor, B half diminished seventh, E7, A minor, get the idea. Lead sheets come in a couple of different versions. There's a version that you see on your screen. This is from a book called the Jazz Fake Book. It's basically using normal notation and a font for the different chord symbols. If you look at the real book, which is a more popular book, you get things like this. For example, on Stella by Starlight, you'll get the melody and chord symbols, but the chord symbols are obviously more of a jazz font. And the notes as well are using a jazz font. If you scroll down, you can see that sometimes lead sheets provide melody, but also a bass clef to know how to comp along with the tune. And then on Stolen Moments, you can see that there's a bass line written in here and some chord suggestions. So again, lead sheets are pretty much just melody and chord symbols, but also other suggested elements such as how to play chord voicings and rhythms with your left hand and bass lines as well. All right, the next thing is what we call jazz harmony. Now, in classical music, a lot of the harmony is built on what we call tertian harmony. In jazz, it's still tertian harmony, but it's a more complex harmony. It's more based on what we call extensions on chords versus simple triads. For example, in classical music, you'll mostly have triads or seventh chords, sometimes diminished chords, whereas in jazz, you've got the same, except you're adding extensions on top of that. So instead of, for example, a dominant seventh chord in classical music, in jazz, you would have a dominant seventh, sharp 11, flat 13 chord. Well, that's where chord symbols come into play. And of course, chord symbols are part of the lead sheet. Now, the chord symbols that you see in a lead sheet are just suggestions. You'll need to learn how to not just read the chord symbols that are suggested, but how to make better ones on the fly. Let's take a closer look at jazz harmony. Jazz harmony is one of the more complex elements of switching from classical to jazz. Most classical music is built on tertian harmony. Well, so is jazz, but it's more simple tertian harmony. For example, an A minor chord, if we were to look at the tune here, for a classical musician means this. It's 1, flat 3, and 5. So that's an A minor chord. But to a jazz musician, that means much more. It's also suggested that you can use the 7th, the 9th, and the 11th on top of an A minor chord. And how you voice that becomes important to the sound that you make. For example, this is an A minor 11th chord, voiced very differently than a simple triad. The way that you put chords together in a row, for example, in You'd Be So Nice to Come Home To, you can see it's A minor, B half diminished seventh, E7, back to A minor. To me, as a piano player, that means A minor 9/11, to B minor 7th, voiced something like this, to E7 with a flat 9, to A minor, different kind of voicing, and then an E7 with a flat 9, and then an A minor chord. So the choices are essentially endless. And then if you look over to the right of this, you've got a G minor 9 to a C7 to an F major 7. That's a typical 2-5-1 progression in a major key. 2, 5, to 1. And there are unlimited ways to voice those chords in progression. For example, you could do closed voicings. You can do more open voicings. And voice things in fourths. So again, this whole concept of jazz harmony is really understanding the basic tertian harmony, adding extensions, and then finding different ways of voicing those chords to make more interesting jazz sounds. We're going to return to our jazz tips for classical musicians in just a moment. I would like to ask you to reach down and hit the thumbs up button on the video. It really helps us here at the channel. And if you want to weigh in on the conversation and ask some questions, you can do that in the comments area below. Your comments and suggestions will help others find and access this content. And there's a lot of jazz tutorials on this channel that can help you. Plus, we're adding videos like this all the time. If you'd like to subscribe, we'd love to have you. Just click the little bell and we'll notify you of all the upcoming content that we're making. Okay, next on the list is jazz repertoire. In classical music, you probably are working on 2, 3, maybe 5 pieces at the same time, and you're working those over a significant period of time. 2 months, 3 months, even a year to learn and memorize a classical piece. In jazz, it's very different. You typically need to learn about 100 pieces at the same time. And by learning 100 pieces, I mean understanding the melody and the chord changes and being able to play those tunes in a few different keys. They're called jazz standards, and this makes up your repertoire. As I said, there's typically a list of about 50 jazz standards that every jazz musician should know. Let's take a look at a few of these. Jazz standards are considered songs mostly from the Great American Songbook that all jazz musicians share in common, so that when you go to a gig and somebody calls a tune, it's kind of expected that you know that tune. Now, there are jazz standards that are easier than other ones for classical players to begin with. There's actually a video on this channel called 5 Jazz Standards for Beginners. I'm going to put a link to that video right here above my head, but stick around until the end of this video. The tunes that are in that video are LOVE, Perdido, Pent Up House, Take the A Train, and It Had to Be You. The jazz standard that I'm showing you on your screen is another standard that most musicians should know. It's called Stella by Starlight. And it's not just enough to know the standard, you should also know obviously the melody and the changes based on whatever the lead sheet says and changes that you've made up as well. But in addition to that, you also need to learn what's called the form. So for example, a lot of these tunes are 32-bar tunes like the one that you're seeing on your screen. It's basically a bunch of 8-bar sections or 4 different 8-bar sections. And we typically label those sections with an A, B, or C. So for example, this would be A section. And then the B section starts here. And then you've got the closing section, which is D. But a lot of times what will happen with these tunes is you'll get the first 2 sections the same. So this would be A, then A. And then the B section would be the bridge and then back to A. So that's called an AA, BA tune, meaning you only need to learn 2 sections of the piece, which is the A section and the B section, in order to memorize that tune. So again, some standards can be more complicated than others. There are also ABAC tunes, or in the case of Stella, it's ABCD. You get the idea. And lastly, probably the most important skill you'll need to learn is how to improvise. And while we've talked about that a few times throughout this video, I want to dive in and really explain improvisation and what you're up against, because it is a language. And like learning any language, for example, when I was in my 20s, I learned to speak French. You can't learn a language by just listening to it. You have to understand how that language is made up. Improvisation in jazz is mostly based on something we call the bebop language. And unlike learning a spoken language, I can guarantee you the bebop language is 1,000 times more complicated. This is not something where you can learn a couple of phrases and then be able to improvise proficiently. It's going to take some time. I think a lot of classical players think that because of their current skill, that they're going to be able to switch pretty quickly into learning this language. But you really have to start over again. It's almost like going back to the very beginning and learning baby steps. Let's talk specifically about the bebop language and what you're facing. Let's apply some of this bebop language to this tune Stella by Starlight. I think it's a good example because it's basically got a chord for every bar. So for example, the first bar is E half diminished 7, second bar A7 flat 9, then C minor 7 F7. So this would be a 2-5 of B flat. And jazz musicians use those chord symbols and the progression to create solos using the bebop language. But the bebop language is not just scales. For example, a lot of early improvisers will just play a scale over E half diminished 7th, which is this, and then a scale over A7, or a scale over C minor 7. That doesn't make very interesting solos. It ends up sounding like this. That's not really a good bebop solo. The bebop language is essentially made up of patterns, chords. So if you spelled the chord, it would be this, or on A7. And you would connect those together using passing notes or enclosures like this. And then C minor 7. Come down a scale. Chord. Passing notes. And that's basically how the bebop language works. You learn over time different phrases and sayings from the bebop language in order to create an interesting solo. Let's see if we can make an interesting solo out of the first 8 bars of Stella by Starlight. Now, I think it's fairly clear that I have some experience with the bebop language. If this is something you really want to pursue, which is jazz improv, it's not something that you can just ignore. It's essential to learn the language of bebop in order to eventually become a great improviser. There are no shortcuts here. It does take time. The amount of time that it actually takes to learn the bebop language and start to be a seasoned improviser is really up to the player themselves. How much experience do you have as a classical player and have enough technique to dive in and start to learn this language? Okay, classical musicians, there you go. Those are the things that you need to know in order to start playing and become proficient at jazz. Once again, your comments and suggestions and questions should go in the comments area below. And if you're really thinking that this is for you and you want to tackle it, you really want to dive in and learn jazz from the very beginning, I have a great course. It's called The Ultimate Beginner's Guide to Playing Jazz Piano. You can find the first video to that free 10-part series right here and also in the description below.